Ever since the COVID-19 pandemic spread through the globe in 2020 continuing into 2021, there has been much debate over whether the COVID-19 vaccinations are safe or if they cause adverse health issues. Furthermore, stereotypes have been created over the viewpoints of Republicans and Democrats and the COVID-19 vaccinations. After much surveying and research of United States citizens and based on speeches given from both the 2020 Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and the 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden, many have come to the conclusion that Republicans are less inclined to receiving the COVID-19 vaccination over Democrats. In the map charts presented by Mayo Clinic, the top chart on COVID-19 vaccination status, and Politico, the bottom chart on the 2020 presidential election, this conclusion can be proven accurate. States such as California, Colorado, Washington, Maine, and New York have high COVID-19 vaccination rates, and the majority of the population voted for Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate. On the other hand, states such as West Virginia, North Carolina, Wyoming, and Arkansas have lower vaccination rates, and the majority of the population voted for Donald Trump, the Republican candidate. There are exceptions to this conclusion, such as Florida, which is highly vaccinated but voted majority Republican. In this study, the focus was on the relationship between COVID-19 vaccination status and which candidate was voted for in the 2020 presidential election in North Carolina. The following study assesses and analyzes any correlation between COVID-19 vaccination status and the 2020 presidential candidate voted for in North Carolina to support the hypothesis that more Democrats are vaccinated over Republicans.
The main method that we used to attempt to observe a relationship between political affiliation and vaccination status was a survey. The survey was created and sent out to North Carolina voters who were asked the following questions. First, are you currently vaccinated? To which respondents could either answer yes, no, or one dose, indicating that they have received one dose of a two-dose vaccination series such as Pfizer or Moderna. Next, if the respondents indicated no, they were asked if they plan to become vaccinated in the future, to which they could respond yes, no, or I have a medical or religious exemption. Then, respondents were asked which political party did you vote for in the 2020 election, either Democrat, Republican, or a third party. Finally, respondents were asked to indicate which county in North Carolina they were registered to vote in. We then analyzed the data that was given to us through the survey responses by putting it into charts such as tables and graphs. The tables made it easier to observe specific numbers for calculations, and the graphs make data more visually appealing and allowed for us to observe trends easier. All in all, the charts made it simpler to understand the existing relationship between political affiliation and vaccination status.
Chart 1, which is not included in our slideshow due to size, is a visual representation of how many North Carolina counties the survey reached and can be used as a rough representation for how the majority of the people voted in the 2020 presidential election, and if the majority of the population is vaccinated or unvaccinated. Chart 1 includes the rank of the county by population size, the county name, and the population size and number, as well as the categories from the survey like presidential voter status and vaccination status. The information is organized this way so that any correlations or trends can be easily recognized and documented. This chart is included to demonstrate the credibility of the survey so that people know the survey included more than just one or two counties, which would indicate bias and not fully represent the state of North Carolina. In the survey, 34 of the 100 North Carolina counties are represented, with a total response of 161 people. The counties are ranked by size, so people can expect to see more responses from larger counties. Graph 1 and Graph 2 are included to visually convey the same information and correlations that Chart 2 made, but in a pie chart and bar chart, respectively, in order to give perspective on the size differences in vaccinated and unvaccinated with the associated political party. An important aspect that needs to be remembered when analyzing this graph is the difference in political party representation in the survey. There are 89 Democrats represented, whereas there are only 69 Republicans and 3 third-party voters. The difference in political party representation will have an effect on the different parts of the pie chart in Graph 1 and the length of the bar graph in Graph 2. In Graph 1, the teal represents Republican voters with one dose of the vaccine. The orange is Republican voters that are unvaccinated. The green is Republican voters that are vaccinated. The red is Democrat voters that are unvaccinated. The blue is Democrat voters that are vaccinated. And the pink is third-party voters that are vaccinated. The other categories, including Democrat voters with one dose, third-party voters that are unvaccinated, and the third-party voters that only have one dose, are not represented in the pie chart because there were no responses matching these categories in the survey. In Graph 2, the blue bar represents the vaccinated population, The red bar represents the unvaccinated population, and the yellow bar represents the population with one dose of the vaccination. Chart 3 is included to further analyze what the unvaccinated population's plans were for the future, meaning are they or are they not considering getting vaccinated against COVID-19 in the future. In the survey, 4 of the 24 unvaccinated people said yes, they do plan on getting vaccinated, while 17 out of the 24 of the unvaccinated people said no, they do not have plans on getting vaccinated. The remaining 3 unvaccinated people stated they have a medical or religious exemption and assumably would not be receiving the COVID-19 vaccination. The chart breaks down the yes, no, or I have a medical or religious exemption responses from the survey by political party affiliation so that people can see which political party was more inclined to getting vaccinated, while also keeping in mind that a majority of the unvaccinated population represented by the survey are Republican and there are no third-party voters from the survey that are unvaccinated. Graph 3 is a visual representation of the information from Chart 3. This graph was included in order to visually show the difference in the answers to the 24 unvaccinated people in the survey, either yes, no, or I have a medical or religious exemption. Similar to Chart 3, it is important to remember that there is a difference in sample size of the different political parties. In the survey, there are 21 Republicans who claim they were unvaccinated and only 3 Democrats, so there will be an obvious larger Republican response.
And here are some interpretations for the results. Chart 1 is the very raw data collected from surveys, simultaneously showing distribution characteristics of collected samples among all North Carolina residents. The larger population the county has, the more samples are collected from the survey. The sample collection can go wrong in several ways. Firstly, the sample is not random enough to truly reflect the population of interest. The sample should be sufficiently large and unbiased to avoid the error. In this research, the population includes all 2020 presidential election voters in North Carolina, when the 161 samples collected are all 2020 presidential candidate voters from 34 of the 100 North Carolina counties. Incomplete coverage of all counties in North Carolina indicates potential deviation of sample results from the total population. Additionally, 161 numbers of samples isn't big enough to represent the whole population of individuals in North Carolina counties, which increases both non-randomness and chance variability. However, the number of samples is the largest we can achieve through sending and spreading surveys during the given time. Furthermore, the survey is with minimized chance of bias and errors elicited by unclear wording and context. And there's hardly inaccurate bias in this survey since it's totally anonymous and safe for voters to do the survey. Nevertheless, a potential non-response bias would inevitably happen as Trump voters use the internet less often than Biden voters. The pie chart in Graph 1 is the first visualization of correlation between vaccine status and 2020 presidential election voter status, which shows the proportion of all data and highlights the share of all components. As Graph 1 shows, the pie is mostly composed by Democratic and Republican voters, with 41% Republican, 54.3% Democratic, and 4.7% one-dose vaccinated and third-party vaccinated. This statistic isn't paralleled with 2020 United States presidential election result in North Carolina, as Trump won 49.93% votes in all counties in North Carolina, with Biden winning 48.59%. This inconsistency corroborates the non-response bias mentioned in Chart 1, as Trump voters have less access to our online survey than Biden voters. Though already shown in Graph 1 that a larger proportion of Democratic voters are vaccinated than that of Republican voters, the bar chart in Graph 2 more directly visualizes the gap between different vaccine status among presidential election voters. Shown by the difference in bar length, Democratic voters have an overwhelming advantage in its vaccination rate than the other, indicating a strong correlation between vaccine status and 2020 presidential election voter status. Visualization of collected sample data from Chart 3 is presented in the form of a stacked bar chart, which directly shows the difference in percentage of voters in different political parties giving the same answers. As shown by Graph 3, among both those who plan to and not plan to get vaccinated in the near future, Republican voters occupy a bigger proportion than Democratic voters. However, since the red bar saying yes is shorter than that saying no, it means more proportions of Republicans refuse to be vaccinated. What's more, those who have a medical and religious exception of not being vaccinated are all Republican voters, suggesting that there are many more factors preventing the vaccination of Republican voters or at least affecting their vaccination rate.
After analyzing the data collected in our survey, as well as looking at other credible sources, our conclusion that Republicans are less inclined to receiving the COVID-19 vaccine over Democrats was proven correct. Even though only a small number of North Carolina voters were surveyed, it is highly unlikely that the accuracy of the survey responses were untruthful because the survey was completely anonymous. Graph 1 and 2 above both clearly show that the number of Democrats vaccinated in North Carolina is a good bit higher than the number of Republicans vaccinated in North Carolina. Overall, the data we collected completely supports our prediction, and there is not any evidence that was collected that would prove our prediction to be false. These are our references that we used throughout our research and paper to help us prove our prediction to be true.